As a channel that preaches the importance of psychedelics, I wanted to share the following clip with the audience.
I think the internet is the physical analog to the psychedelics. Until the internet arose, it was very hard for me to see how we were going to get from here to the omega point. Now I have no problem. It's all in place. I mean, the internet has to grow faster. The bandwidth has to be expanded, the codes have to be simplified, the protocols have to be simplified, and everybody has to be brought online. When that happens, I think there will be a kind of natural reorganization of society, because what we're living in, and this is a McLuhanist rap, what we're living in is a linear, print-created world. It was created by print heads. They couldn't help themselves. They thought they were normal human beings, but they were very, very dramatically distorted by their relationship to typography. And they created this kind of world. Well, now we're moving into the era of electronic culture.
Electronic culture. Perhaps when all the narratives are spun simultaneously and people are interacting with their own unique set of information, there's a kind of grand separation that occurs. A separation among people who are operating within entirely separate matrices. These are defined by what news do you consume? What is your ideological intuition? How do you conceive a progression of this great system, this great engine? If that's a little bit too abstract for people, let's bring it back to the political sphere. What is actually happening with this Israel-Palestine conflict? Because it's a kind of deluge of information, the likes of which we just don't have familiarity with. If you go down either a pro-Israeli or a pro-Palestine rabbit hole and seek out precisely the information you want to corroborate a worldview, what's to say that there aren't multiple timelines being created in real time? This isn't typically how the issue is discussed, but the reason I highlight it in these terms is that people don't have a particularly spiritual view of this conflict. Within the minds of many people, there's a certainty that this war will conclude one particular way, and more importantly, that the conflict itself will be remembered one particular way. But that just doesn't seem to be, at least in my view, what is happening. There's an inordinate amount of proliferation of data, information that highlights transgressions of both sides. People are so convinced of their narrative that one thing is happening. The Israelis are the oppressive ones. Oh no, it's the Arabs, the Palestinians, Hamas, who are anti-Semitic, and their true mission underneath it all is to just destroy the Jews. As it pertains to the majority of the population interacting with this conflict, a conflict that is far removed, most of this is complete nonsense. You're just a singular data point witnessing a very specific selection of information that has been provided to you by algorithmic mechanisms, the likes of which and the formulations of which you have no control over. Your mind about this issue is being controlled. Your mind about this issue is being molded to a form, and the way you conceive of it is, in my view, going to have a direct relationship to what you experience. What will you do when the conflict gets closer and closer? Will you run away from it? Will you enter into the heat of that combat? Everyone is going to have a different way of interacting with the war that is around us. And perhaps the whole dynamic of war itself has evolved in the 21st century. The more digital warfare, where the different viewpoints are being hashed out and debated vociferously on social media channels, is a more accurate representation of most people's experience of this conflict. And that might make us seem very weak and pitiful in historical context, but think about the psychological impact that this information has on people. I know that this war has an unbelievably deleterious effect on people's emotions and how they feel about the universe and the place they inhabit. Yes, you don't technically know what's going on if you're not in Israel or you're not in Gaza. You're merely reading some information that has been produced. But think about the limitation of that information and whether it actually captures the true essence. And if it isn't capturing what's really going on, whatever that means, what are the consequences? I mean, I remember hearing Daniel Dennett, who recently passed away, rest in peace, and his horror with the notion of a post-epistemic world. And I think that might be an oversimplification of what we're working with, but the notion of epistemology and the way in which epistemological foundations can be established, they need to be updated in this world. As Terence is saying, we're no longer guided by these printheads producing a linear progression of society. It's so far beyond that at this point. Every single day, people are interacting and commenting, engaging and interfacing with legions and legions of information, and that information is subsequently being calibrated to our conscious experience. At least that's what seems to be happening.
And all kinds of phenomenon associated with the old way of doing things are going to disappear. For example, a quality of print culture was the phenomenon called mass media. Mass media is finished. It doesn't make any sense anymore.
Mass media is finished, and they are quite resentful about it in the meantime, because the natural expectation that's been fostered over the last several decades is that there are these authority figures that should have dominion over the kinds of information that are proliferated. Of course, anyone who's familiar with the psychedelic experience like Terence knows that what exactly constitutes experience and information worth proliferating is very much dependent on one's individual subjective experience. And yes, there are collective experiences that we can share, but we're not exactly aware of how collectivity emerges. We don't know the process that binds humanity together. And at the moment, while we all walk around guided by the very information that we are exposed to, we really have no idea where everyone else in our world is heading. The person walking by looking down at the phone right in front of them, not looking at where they're going, might be engaged in a completely different informational landscape. And on your conscious end, they merely look like an NPC. Right? You wouldn't know who someone is until you step inside their world and really get to know what they're experiencing. Until that connection is made, it's just a material abstraction, or at least that's what it's becoming. And there's a danger in starting to view your world in that way. It's starting to materialize your society. I mean, the Gnostics had a fear of entering the material. There was a conflict within the Gnostic mind between the material world and the spiritual world. Their determination was that the material world was evil. I don't think that process is evil on its own, but I do think it's one that facilitates evil, because it facilitates almost a hierarchical treatment, much in the like of how humans ultimately separated themselves from animals and considered themselves superior to animals, and thus it was open season on the animals and other life forms within their proximity. You can think about how humanity has treated the planet, right? It's a complicated relationship. There's a level of exploitation. There's also a level of preservation and care and protection. But, it's a challenging relationship that we have with nature. We're still dealing with it. And the only way we learn how to interact with our environment is by imposing a certain set of rules. Hopefully those rules are going to be timeless blueprints for conscious interaction. Because if they aren't, the culture is going to dissolve, new cultures will emerge, and you're going to have no idea how to interact within the current iteration of reality. It's amazing how things have transformed. You seriously look at what is before you and compare it to what took place 100 years ago or 200 years ago. There just isn't very much resemblance. At this point, there isn't even resemblance between what the world was like 25 years ago.
Mass media is one-to-many communication. And what the internet offers is any-to-any communication. You know, we all have contempt, or I assume we do, or mild contempt, for the tabloid newspapers that we see when we check through the grocery store. Elf or dwarf rapes nun, flees in UFO, that kind of thing. Well, but now let's think about the New York Times for a moment. The New York Times is designed for what? To be read by millions of people. Who would want to read something designed to be read by millions of people?
The kind of person who wants to become part of a kind of collective and has no other means of doing so. I mean, this is the cost of losing touch with traditional religious structures, as irrational as they may seem, is that they breed the need for people to become part of other forms of collective. People who read the New York Times and respect the longevity of it are responding to an era in which the New York Times was the staple of information delivery. Like, this was the newspaper that people respected. And at this point, we've started to create so many different sources of information that there can be no staple of information proliferation. That's not a thing anymore. There is no one trusted news source. There is no Walter Cronkite. That's not to say that there isn't information that should be prioritized, or that there is certain information that provides a better or an optimal blueprint for engaging with the world. It's not so easy to say that a singular newspaper can offer that. Like, there's a reason we have religions and that these texts last a long time, is that it's supposed to go beyond what can be provided on a cursory level about what is taking place within this precise cultural moment. It's a very narrow point of view. There's nothing that the New York Times can inform you of that will guide you as to how you ought to live your life. It simply is impossible. And that's not the purpose of the New York Times, to be clear. But this goes back to Terence's point. The reason why one reads the New York Times is to be informed with other people who are reading the New York Times. If you don't read the New York Times, or from a more extreme point of view, if you think the New York Times is a bunch of bunk propaganda, you're not working with the same set of assumptions. What point of view is correct? It doesn't even matter. The answer is yes. These perspectives are exclusive from one another.
You print things. You assemble the parts. You assemble the small parts and create completed objects. So this notion that stresses uniformity, interchangeability, and co-equality of subunits creates the entire political and social ambiance of the post-Renaissance mind. Now, something entirely different is happening. The new media is non-linear. It doesn't require lockstep acquiescence in a model of behavior. That's why fringe elements, which were kept very much at the fringe through the reign of print, have in the 20th century broken out and managed to set the agenda.
And boy, have they broken out in the 21st century. We're going through this transformation of the structures of power that govern reality, moving between governmentally controlled, managed reality, let's say, to something that more approximates private ownership. The legalization of drugs or agents that induce different conscious experience is one manifestation of that. But another expression might be the ongoing tension right now between governments and corporations. Who is actually in control? Are the governments in control of the corporations, or are the corporations in control of the government? And if it's corporations controlling the people supposedly responsible for constructing the legislation, what does that say as to whether we live in a democracy or republic or any other one of these government-organized systems versus a corporatocracy or a corporately controlled oligarchy. We already know that search engines like Google have massive power over controlling what information is produced and the factual nature of that information. When such an ability is laid out on a trajectory, the consequence is that elections become manipulated. And elections have always been manipulated to a certain degree, but now we have a numerical way of defining how the elections are manipulated. Through sufficient analysis, you can actually discern how many people were swayed in their vote, how many people who would have voted for this candidate based on the information they had access to changed their vote to this candidate due to the manipulation of the information proliferated to them. And that has major consequences as to how we conceive of our own human free will and agency, and whether this is a democracy or whether democracy is an illusion. Has it been an illusion the whole time? What am I talking about? Do you get it? I guess only time will tell.
Of much of society. So things like surrealism, jazz, ethnic consciousness, homosexuality, different styles of dissent have in the 20th century all gained a great deal more prominence.
And boy, have they gained more prominence in the 21st century, with certain consequences. I mean, I think people like Terence had a very left-wing intuition that it's good to dissolve these boundaries between all forms of people, between the kinds of sexualities that are permitted versus not being permitted. Of course, we're getting to this convergence point where all hierarchy is called into question. The hierarchy between parents and their kids, whether young people should be permitted to reveal their bodies on a public forum and sell their sexuality for economic compensation on the internet. More cultural conservatives are going to be like, this is crazy, hell no, we're completely abandoning Judeo-Christian values. And people with more anarchist intuitions are going to be like, to hell with the past traditions. They weren't doing us any good anyway. And you could have seen this coming the whole time. The left wing is going to dissolve these boundaries of hierarchy. Chip away, chip away, chip away. There is no such thing as an optimal expression of sexuality. Chip away, chip away, chip away. There is no such thing as gender or sex altogether. Chip away, chip away, chip away. The boundaries between what constitutes a parent and a child are insignificant and should be challenged. Chip away, chip away. There is no difference between cultures. The outcomes are the same and they should be equalized. Chip away, chip away, chip away. You can probably tell based on my voice that I am skeptical of some of these transformations, perhaps more so than Terence McKenna himself. Terence had a tendency to see the wonder and potential, the possibility, the beneficence that could be fostered when we embrace true connectivity and dissolve boundaries. I don't think he tended to see the emergence of these various Pandora's boxes that are inevitably opened when we decide to cross all of these boundaries. And the weird thing is that within this era in which information travels so quickly, we're forced to confront the Pandora's boxes all at once. There isn't any time to process this multifaceted equation that's taking root.
Prominence as the print culture gave way to the electronic culture. And in the future, I think these enormous structures which we're asked to participate in are just going to fade away, like national governments. I think basically we're going to live in a world which has only two levels. The local level, basically your watershed, and the planetary level. And the systems of control that lie between those two levels will be very thin and invisible.
Well, you better hope they're going to be really thin, because that's the whole fear with a global government. Well, I don't know what those in the World Economic Forum have in mind. I think those who take on the mission of planetary leadership are apt to overestimate the extent of their responsibility and capacity to manage that power with care. There is something inherently narcissistic about bringing a group of people together to discuss global issues outside of the purview of the billions of people who are experiencing those global issues. What exactly do you know and have the right to declare on behalf of other people who live so distinctly from yourself? It's a very dangerous game that you play once you establish global ordinance that is anything more than thinly veiled. If you don't keep it thin, then you lose all individual liberty, and it becomes incredibly tyrannical. I think Terence and I both come from pretty similar backgrounds in terms of how we think about these issues. However, we might have slightly different intuitions as to the dangers that emerge. I'm a little bit more attuned to the negative consequences of what has transpired, which he very nicely articulated in this video.
Information confers power, and if you have it, you hold it. The electronic game is a game where all information is equally accessible and shareable, and it creates a different and more egalitarian information field.